And we're like those who want to defund the police. We really want to dethrone God. It's not that we don't want a peaceful life or that we never do anything nice for anybody. It's really just that we don't want God to rule over us. And God is the ruler, and he's the maker of the law.
Thank you for tuning in to the Removing Barriers podcast. I'm Jay.
And I'm MCG.
And we're attempting to remove barriers so we can all have a clear view of the cross.
This is episode 75 of the Removing Barriers podcast. And in this episode, we will be sitting down with Officer CigarBro to discuss the consequences of defunding the police and the human sinful nature. Later in this episode, DW will also join in the discussion. In the past year or more, we have seen an increase in crime in major cities and an increase in attacks on law enforcement officers. That can be linked directly to the Defund the Police movement. But before all that, Jay, what is the origin and background of the Defund the Police movement?
The Defund the Police slogan gained traction at the death of George Floyd. And it was a slogan that many people on the left, racial activists, and of course, left-wing radicalists used to describe something that they want to bring to pass. That is either completely dismantling police forces across the country, disbanding the police force altogether, or in some cases, it could mean allocating money away from the police departments and putting them toward other social services. It could be access to food banks, access to abortion, access to housing, all of these different social programs that the local governments and the federal governments might have their fingers in. And so when you say defund the police, I think it's important to make sure that we're defining the entire spectrum, because not everyone who would say defund the police are literally meaning to dismantle the police force and do away with police altogether. They're not coming at it from an anarchist type point of view. Some of them just think, well, the police have way too much money. Their budgets are way too big and they're not doing what we want them to do in the neighborhood. And so let's take some money away from them and allocate them to other resources. Many people on the Democratic left side of the spectrum, of the political spectrum in the United States, have kind of taken up this slogan back in 2020, that is, and they began publicly calling for defunding the police. And as of the summer of 2020, 13 cities in different states in the country have actually made good on that slogan and slashed their police budgets by a third or by several million. Austin, Texas was the most drastic in their cut. 33.3%, I think it was, slashed from their police budget for Austin, Texas. But what's happening now is that because of the rise in crime and the emboldening of criminals, many of these states or these cities that have slashed their police funding are working to refund the police, because they're beginning to realize, oh, we can't run a city with criminals running amok. We need police. And so they're actively trying to get police back on the force. They're actively trying to put money back into the budget for policing. But they're finding that many of the police officers are fed up. We've seen many police officers either take their early retirement or they've decided to leave altogether. Many of them in protest have called out sick in a form of protest, like a mass call out sick or mass not showing up, in order to protest how they're being treated by their own local governments. They're saying that you can't expect the police to do their jobs while you give criminals a free pass. And so there's this back and forth. In addition to that, what we need to understand is that defund the police is more of a political thing than it is an actual thing that people want in the country. It's very unpopular among the American people. I would say perhaps only 34% of the American population agrees with the notion of defunding the police in any form, whether it's dismantling the police or removing funds from the police budget. Only 34% of the country agrees with that. And the overwhelming majority of that 34% are on the political left. And so this is purely a left thing. And I think that in 2021, many people on the left have begun to realize how big of a mistake it was to champion the Defund the Police slogan, because many of them are beginning to backtrack. Many of them are beginning to kind of toughen up on crime now that they've seen the result of Defund the Police. Now, I should say that there is room for debate about what is causing the spike in crime in the United States that we're seeing right now over the past 2-3 years or so, because Defund the Police is concurrent with many of these high-profile police shootings that have been happening. It's concurrent with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's concurrent with these things. All of these things can have a role to play with the spike in crime. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that because of the Defund the Police position or ideology or posture of politicians in these cities, that criminals feel very much emboldened to do whatever they want. It's actually a new thing for us to see the types of crimes, the types of, you call it barefacedness, right, what you said in a former podcast, where they would just walk into a store and just fill trash bags with stuff and walk out. This has happened in California, particularly in corner stores like CVS, Walgreens, these type of places, where they've decriminalized larceny, theft, and these kind of things, where if it's not more than $1,000, then we don't have to prosecute it. You don't have to worry about it. So people are just walking in with garbage bags and filling up their bags with stuff and walking out. We've seen many people do these flash smash and grab type operations where a bunch of people just roll up to a store, smash the windows, grab stuff and leave. We have cargo trains that are being looted and completely eviscerated of all of their goods when they pull into the station for a stop. Criminals are just kind of jumping out of the woodworks, smashing stuff, taking boxes and running. So we can say that Defund the Police definitely has a role to play in emboldening criminals and emboldening petty theft criminals in these kinds of things. We just don't know to what degree. But that's what the results of the Defund the Police movement is. Again, we can make arguments here and there about how much of it is based on what's causing it. But certainly it's not beyond the realm of possibility that it has emboldened criminals across the country. And now that the politicians are seeing the negative backlash, they're beginning to back away from it.
Yeah, let's bring in Officer CigarBro because he's the resident expert here, police officer in the United States. Officer, thank you for joining us again.
Yep, thank you so much for having me again.
Great.
Good to see you.
What do you think this movement is trying to accomplish, the Defund the Police movement? Jay said a lot there, so we're going to unpack some of that, but what do you think this movement is trying to accomplish?
The Defund the Police movement, I think it's like anything. They're trying to, present the problem that needs to be solved. Yes, there is, the mental health aspect, there is dealing with the homeless aspect and everything like that, but it got so out of control to where you're literally having police departments being pretty much almost abolished in terms of, being slashed and being cut. And what's very strange about this Defund the Police thing is that everyone so far that is touting that or has been sharing and has been posting and has been dealing with that, I've noticed that once the crime and everything started ticking up, they didn't really say, oh, this is a bad idea. Most of them have just kind of silently gone away and just silently disappeared. They're omitting that they said that in the past, they were for this. A lot of people that I have met that are willing to talk to me, at least on the job, and family members and friends and stuff like that, they all said, this is not a good idea. Yeah, sure, we should fix these problems that maybe the police are kind of handling too much on top of real serious crimes, but just straight up taking money away or cutting budgets or cutting staff members and patrol officers is not the way to go about it. And we're clearly seeing that now with the spike in crime. And with your point, Jay, about the recent police-involved shootings and everything, 2021 was the highest year that law enforcement has been feloniously killed. So there's about 73 officers that have been killed, unprovoked, most of them. And it's been since 9/11. Now, not including 9/11, it's been 1995 since we had a highest number like that.
Wow.
But it's a 20-year high if you include 9/11. And that's the result of that because a lot of criminals are being emboldened on that. They know that we're kind of disempowered. But you also kind of have to think about it in terms of it's not just the Defund the Police movement. It's pushing the politicians to do these things. And it's also pushing the state's attorney to drop charges and let these people go, or kind of modify things to where criminals and bad actors know that we can only do so much and that this is to encourage us. So I know this is a huge thing. We can keep on going about it. I mean, there may have been some good. I'm not going to say it was all bad. There may have been some good, but it's been overruled. It's been like overtaken by this like toxicity and this negativity of just bad decisions and like malicious decisions to do these kind of things.
When you say that there's been some good, could you elaborate? What good have you seen from the movement that has been overshadowed by the obvious negative effects of the movement?
What I think is saying that like, hey, police officers are taking too much and they're handling too much, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah,
we're doing all these things like the mental health stuff, which I'm not saying that we shouldn't go. We absolutely do need to go. I've been to a lot of mental health calls and like mental health crises where the police needed to be there because the guy unfortunately was being very violent and a social worker would not calm the situation down. I'm not saying replace police officers with social workers where clearly the police can be able to handle. But in terms of like really the only thing I can really kind of see about it is that with the statement of like, hey, they're handling a lot of stuff, maybe we could help them out. But what ended up happening is that they're just taking money away from us. So instead of like defund the cops, maybe we should, just give them more classes or maybe help them out, give them a supplement in terms of like, actually in my department, we have something called mobile crisis where we have an actual specialized unit that has an actual clinician that does want to go out there into the field and talk to these mentally ill folks, but they have a cop with them as well too. And that's only after a patrol officer such as myself requests them to come down and say, hey, this person's willing to talk. It's calm right now. The situation's safe. He's not like running around with a knife and like trying to stab something. Like that's not going to help. Like I'm not going to call them for that. But if it's a calm situation to where we can calm them down, then that specialized unit can come out there. And that's kind of what I see what they're doing. But again, like that's not even in the equation now. Like they just completely took that out or it's been overtaken, like I said before.
Yeah, what do you think they're seeking to accomplish, Jay? Because Officer CigarBro mentioned some stuff there, but it seemed that there's also maybe a political motivation behind of this and also maybe even a racial equity thing kind of behind of this. Do you think that they may be trying to accomplish some of that? Falsely so, maybe?
Okay, so this is where I sound like I have a tinfoil hat on, and I may or may not have it on right now as we do this particular podcast. But here's what I think is actually happening. This is, at its highest level, an attempt to subvert and undermine law, order, and authority in order to corrupt the minds of not just the people that are living, but the youth in particular. If you create a society of people who are just run by their emotions and they're not thinking clearly about the particular situation, they're not gathering facts, they're not trying to understand the situation, they're just reacting to what they happen to see on their streets, you can easily control those people. People that are not thinking clearly about it, they're just reacting. You can easily control those people. And I do think that there is an element of perhaps they are politicians, perhaps they are business owners, I'm not sure, very high level, high strata, high class society people who benefit from this kind of upheaval, from this kind of anarchy, from this kind of anti-authoritarian sentiment. And they're encouraging it. They're fostering it. Okay, that's my tinfoil hat side. Okay, so here's my non-tinfoil hat answer. There are people in the Defund the Police movement that are seeking to highlight what they feel is a problem within their police forces. The issue of police brutality, perhaps of racial profiling, perhaps of what they perceive to be a low number or low percentage of cases that are actually solved, that are actually resolved. And so they're trying to put a spotlight on these things. But because they don't have the media pull on their own, they have to attach themselves to something more radical in order to get that media spotlight. We were talking about the race baiters like Al Sharpton, Reverend, I'm not even going to call him Reverend, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, Benjamin Crump, these types. There are many families who have experienced questionable dealings with the police that may or may not have something to do with race. And they wouldn't normally pair up with these people, but because these people have the ability to draw media spotlight, they feel like they have to. It's like choosing the less of two evils. Do you kind of fight the battle on the ground on your own without resources because you're trying to do this by yourself? Or do you attach yourself to the leech that Benjamin Crump is and get some media spotlight, but you may get results for your particular case? I think perhaps the Defund the Police has that same element where people want to highlight issues that they see in the policing of their communities, but they don't know how else to do it except to latch on to people who have press. They say that any press is good press, particularly in entertainment. Any press is good press, whether it's good or bad press, any press is good press. And so they might have that particular idea. There could be some of that happening in the Defund the Police movement too. So those people who are seeking to enact change in how their neighborhoods are policed may attach themselves to the Defund the Police movement in order to execute or find a way to bring that change about. The problem is that you receive whatever change you feel like you might want, but you also get 100 pounds of baggage of negative consequences that now you have to deal with as well, which is unfortunate. From the political viewpoint, I can't fathom any other reason why anyone would support Defund the Police except that they perceive that that's what the people want. And so they're just going with what they think the people want. You see people marching in the streets, and so visually, it's jarring to see so many citizens in the street. Oh my goodness, this must be what they want. Okay, defund the police, everybody, let's go, defund the police. And then they project this rhetoric. But they don't really personally believe it as politicians. They just will tell you what you want to hear in order to be reelected.
They want power.
Yeah.
They want power. Exactly. It's also...
They want those brownie points.
Exactly. So it could be all of those things rolled up into one sausage.
Yeah, but who's to be blamed here, though? It seems to me like the chicken have come home to roost because the Defund the Police movement gained some traction. Then we see crimes explode all around the country. As Jay mentioned, 13 different cities around this country have seen a major increase in violent crimes. So who's to blame for this movement? Let me bring you in on this, officer.
The movement, I think, honestly, like the protests and everything, the only way I can really describe them is kind of like useful idiots. And then, but the ones I really do blame is the politicians kind of either using this because they're scared or using this for brownie points for political gain. Therefore, they're just doing it just to not only appease the mob, because the mob will burn down the town, and it's very, very strange. I don't know if this anecdote will be comparable, but for example, when I was down there for the protest, this was maybe like nearby 4th of July where rioting was still happening. Antifa was actually down nearby where I actually patrolled at. There's about maybe 200 of them. They tried storming the headquarters. We told them to stop. We pretty much told them to stop. But then they went down towards a Christopher Columbus statue. One of the officers who was just doing patrol, because we still need to answer the calls for service, he started keying up. It's like, hey, they're going to head towards the Christopher Columbus statue, and they're going to tear it down. And we actually had a mobile field force, which pretty much is their riot team, for lack of a better term, for short. And they're like, hey, we're standing by. What do you want us to do? 20 minutes go by, and then the same officer who was witnessing this whole thing, he said, hey, they just tore down the statue and threw it into the water, into the harbor. And after that, we were all just like, they're going to stop him? They're going to arrest him? What's going on here? They ended up just letting them leave at that point in time. And the commissioner at this point in time said he didn't want to cause a scene or want to cause a problem or anything. And a lot of us were just like, but you're just pretty much telling them that they can pretty much do this,
right,
and everything. You know, like you can say whatever you want about Christopher Columbus. That's neither here nor there. Like, it's not even on public property. The statue was part of a community group that owns that part of part where the statue was. Honestly, I always kind of point towards the leaders. Like, I used to be in the Marine Corps myself. Like, I used to be like a fire team leader as a corporal. And they always emphasize, at least in the military, that like, hey, you own the leadership. You try to do what you can. There's certain things that you can't control, but you can at least try to make things the best that you can at that time. And they kind of just let them do that because I think they were honestly just scared of getting on the news for like riots and the whole controversy of Columbus. And they're like, you should just let them, eat the statue in the harbor or whatever. And the politics is really just the hard part, where in reality, we should have just stopped them. Honestly, just stop them to prevent that from happening in the first place and everything. But
do you feel like your hands are tied as a police officer? Because I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that police officers have been a little bit hesitant in making certain arrests, especially arrests that involve black folks. And if the police officer is white, do you feel any way that there are arrests that you don't want to make just because of the racial or political situation that's going on?
It's a sad thing because like that's unfortunately like a reality. It shouldn't even be that. It's turned into a point to where like the shootings and stuff like that, where it's like it should be, hey, did this officer do the right thing in this scenario or not? And that's what it should be. But the problem is now it's the racial part. And then really that should not be a factor. It should be whether or not it's a good shooting or not, or it's a good arrest or not, or whatever that scenario may be. But unfortunately now, especially when we have these situations where I'm in a different department now to where a lot of people will start using that. And like, I'm not white, I'm mixed. So I'm like half white, half Filipino. So for me, it's a little bit different, but I notice like a lot of the other officers who are white, and they do get into an interaction where they do have the legal justification to make an arrest on somebody, the crowd starts to amp up. And the officers, like, he's right, but he's also kind of getting more angry because they're putting these accusations towards them when it's really not true. You know what I mean? So it does feel like we are tying our, like, how do I say this? Like, they are tying our hands, but we're kind of like, I don't want to be called a racist, so sure, I'll put my hand behind my back, almost. So it's very hard right now to do this stuff. Like, yes, you can still do your job, and at the same time, like, social media will blow it up and make it seem like something completely, and we've seen that so many times before, where there was one scenario where a dude was getting arrested, they did a traffic stop, gentleman was getting arrested, like, both of the occupants, driver and passenger, were black. The officer was white. He actually pulls out a bag full of drugs. One of them was a small baggie, didn't have anything. He threw it into the car. And the person was like, hey, I got you recorded. You threw that in there. And then this 10-second clip from that passenger made it seem like he was planting evidence. And they're like, all right, that looks really terrible. It looks really bad. But come to find out on the body cam footage is that he just had a trash bag and he was just throwing it back into the car. And so, and even then, some people were like, well, I would just put it in my pocket. I'm like, well, that shouldn't really be the case. Like, his trash, it came from the car. He's going to put it back in the car. That's neither here nor there with the trash thing. But regardless, that 10-second video, it blew up immediately. And luckily, at that department, I can't remember where it was from, that department actually covered that officer. It's like, look, we're going to wait. We're going to see the full investigation. And then they released the body cam footage of what was actually happening.
Yeah, but the problem there, the damage was already done.
Yes.
That's what this social media and this quick run to judgment without context kind of create. Because a lot of time, if we don't wait for, at least a better video, a different angle, more evidence to come out, we jump to judgment and start blaming the police officers when we don't have enough information to come to a conclusion. Do you feel like as a police officer that your hands are being tied by higher ups, maybe the person above you or the person above the person that's above you? Because this seems to me like it's coming from not police officers that we're going to encounter on the street, but it's coming from people way above them. Do you feel that's the case?
I do feel like that's the case because, like, it's very strange because, like, I see it mainly, and you guys see it as well, too, mainly for those who stay on top of, like, the more, I guess, controversial videos or whatever. And you start to see that the chief is like, I think in Washington, D.C., these 3 police officers were like wrestling this guy and on the fence. And then this one officer was punching this dude in the face. I'm like, it looks kind of bad, but come to find out the dude actually had a gun in his waistband. So the officer punching him in the face was actually kind of justified because the 2 officers were struggling to get his hands behind his back and he was pulling it as if he was trying to reach for the waistband. And so you kind of put 2 and 2 together. It's like, all right, he's trying to reach for the gun. And they're trying to prevent that from happening to where it will bind up into a shooting. But the chief, I think it was the chief in Washington, D.C. actually condemned it without even like waiting on it, without even saying, hey, it's an investigation. We're going to see what's going to happen or whatever. The video looks bad, but we're going to find out what's going to happen. But instead, the chief straight up on Twitter posted it saying, this is bad, that officer shouldn't have done that, blah, 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 even though he had a gun or whatever. I can't remember his exact tweet, but I remember reading, I was like, what? It's like, yeah, he should have punched him in the face, even though he was trying to reach for a gun in his waistband. I'm like, at least they weren't going to shoot him. And that kind of shows you the restraint that we're kind of in right now. We're in a rock and a hard place. But for higher ups, it's like, I would not say it's the lieutenant. I would not say it's even the captain. In terms of like precinct kind of stuff. Like, this is your precinct. Every precinct usually has like a captain, at most maybe a major. But the higher ups in terms of admin, where a lot of times a lot of those they have like people, politicians or whatever, calling that police department, and usually it's only the higher ups. Like, I'm just throwing a rank out here, like colonel to commissioner, colonel to chief, or something like that, where they get those phone calls when someone's yelling at them. So they kind of get like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I wouldn't say it's like lieutenants where, you know, they're interacting with the regular patrol officer like myself, or, you know, something like that. But it is a lot of times the higher ups they seem to forgot where they came from, because everyone starts in policing as a regular patrol officer, interacting with the community, interacting with the public, and doing the regular stuff just like anybody else. And now that they're up there, it seems like they forget. You know, I always try to be nice and assume that they just seem to forget, instead of them being like, I'm just doing this to cover my butt and, you know, forget these guys.
Or maybe might be the politics of it, because once you get up there, it's a lot more than just police, and I guess it's the politics of it. Because to me, it seems like no, because we're talking about who to be blamed here. We're going to have to go further up and say, what about the government? What about the mayor of these cities, the governor of these states, and also the people that make the laws and tie the police hand? How much blame do we put on that front? Because even the DA, because a lot of these DAs are not charging people, and a lot of these judges are not installing, what they call it,
there are no price in them, or they're suspending all but
bail.
one.
There's no bail, so you just go in,
that's true.
You walk out. So who to blame? It seems like you go all the way up to the courts, the DA, the legislature, the people that make the laws, and the people that supposed
enforce them as well.
Enforce the laws. But then me as a normal citizen would see, firstly, is the police officer. But it doesn't seem like a lot of blame can be placed at the police officer's feet. I think also the woke culture has a lot of blame to put, because the culture or the people are pushing the legislature in one direction. And as we said earlier, it seems like the politicians are doing this just to gain power. But I also think we're looking over one thing. I think the major thing to blame is the human sinful nature, as we talk about. The Bible saying Psalm 51 and verse 5, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And Jeremiah 17 verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? So when you combine all those things, if we don't overlook that men are sinful, inherently bad, and then we have all these people pushing racial stuff in this country, and all these people saying, oh, I think the Defund the Police movement, as I said earlier, chicken has come home to roost, because now we have seen the true depravity of man, because we have removed the restraint that the police have offered. That's what police are there for, to offer some restraint to people. There's a reason why there's not more crime, because the person know that if they do commit this crime, somebody's going to come and take them away. When you remove that, then I can do whatever I want. That's why you're seeing the rise in shoplifting and all these things across
shootings
in California. You know, and then when you tell a certain race of people, and I'm black, when you tell a certain race of people that you don't blame them for their decisions, and then at the same time you make them feel like the police against them, why do you think you see we have shooting in New York and going around all the country? Police officers are being attacked, and then these people are being slapped on the wrist. Even in New York, there was this rapper, I think he was 16 or whatever, shot at a police officer with an illegal gun that he was actually on bail because he was in possession of a legal gun. And they let him go. He shot a police officer. What they going to do again? Well, he has enough money to bond out. So what do you think going to happen? You think he's going to go back and be all nice? And no, we have to enforce the laws that we have. And I just feel like those are not being enforced.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate how that thing that you stated, I have to look that up, but that's not a surprise. A lot of times in my former police department where I would arrest somebody and they would pretty much be out the same day as soon as I'm done all the charging and everything that. Yeah. Now for like things like he has an illegal handgun, like we call it handgun violations in my state, where the Second Amendment's a little bit stricter. It's like they will get handgun violation, and usually now in the police department that I'm in, they will, depending on a certain amount of crime, the court commissioner will determine whether or not they can be released on their own recognizance, meaning that they understand you're not supposed to be doing this, you're supposed to go to this trial date, blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. They can add other things like an unsanctioned bond, where like If you don't come to court, not only will you be held in the detention center until your trial date, but you also have to pay like a couple $1,000s, depending on what that is. And speaking of which, I know it's a side note, but they really do need to teach the general public. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they need to teach the general public on what happens when you get arrested. How do you press charges? How does this work? What does the court commissioner do? What does the judge do? What are the police legally obligated to do or have to do in that state? And then you have to whittle it down to that jurisdiction. Because there's so many things that people, like I've arrested people, like, you haven't Mirandized me. I said, well, I'm not questioning you. Like you, I'm not questioning you. There's no need to Mirandize you. If I wanted to question you, then I'll advise you the rights, but I don't need to question you and everything. But regardless, like I really do think like a class, or maybe not even a class, like it just needs to be presented on what needs to happen. But there's so much confusion, and unfortunately, us as the police in general need to also keep up on like case law and make sure that we're telling people the right things and everything like that too. So I do think that us as the police, we also need to improve as well too in telling people the right things in terms of jurisdiction. So,
yeah. You're listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. We're sitting down with Officer CigarBro, and we're talking about Defund the Police movement and the human sinful nature. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jay. MCG and I would like for you to help us remove barriers by going to removingbarriers.net and subscribing to receive all things removing barriers. If you'd like to take your efforts a bit further and help us keep the mics on, consider donating at removingbarriers.net/donate. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. Did you know that you could find us on Twitter, Gab, Parler, Facebook, and Reddit? Go to removingbarriers.net/contact and like and follow us on social media. Removing Barriers, a clear view of the cross.
All right.
So, police swear to uphold the Constitution. Like military folk, they swear to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They must obey their higher-ups, the captains, the lieutenants, etc. And they have to answer to the politicians that run their particular city, and they've sworn to serve and protect the people. So at times, all of those things clash because they just do. So how do police officers balance those requirements? How do they serve the people and protect them, but still obey all of the people that they have to obey above them, from politician down to the lieutenant, upholding the Constitution? How do police officers balance that?
So for this question, it's a pretty good one. They have to, all law enforcement, everyone up to the chief, they pretty much swear an oath saying that they have to uphold it. Now, of course, like, especially now with all these mandates and everything like that, and a lot of people are saying like, why are the police enforcing this? And I agree, I don't like it as well too. That's probably like the hardest thing I had about that I've always kind of questioned, especially during the start of this pandemic. It's like, I don't really like this kind of stuff. I don't really like, you can kind of see how they're like bending it, if that makes any sense. But for us in general, like all law enforcement officers have to be like certified to like be up to date in terms of like what we call case law. So how do you stop a car? Like, what do you have to do in order to stop a car? When can you remove a person, a driver, or the occupants from the vehicle? And you have to be able to determine all of that. And the higher ups need to know that too. Now, again, like somebody who's been a someone who's been like a colonel, one of those more senior officers, when they haven't been on the street, that mindset kind of like goes to the wayside because they're more focusing on like the politics and the admin position and everything. And I think that might be a result of that. But the police department also works hand in hand with the state's attorney's office as well too, in terms of charging, in terms of like, hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? Because I always ask the state's attorney as well too. I try to be good friends with them. It's like, hey, what can I do here? Can I actually charge this person here with this language based off of the charging language for my state and everything like that? And then of course, like you have defense attorneys, which as much as people don't like them, they think that they're, I guess, slimy for lack of a better term. They keep us in check too to make sure that we're doing the right things. And sometimes they make us look like fools when we're on the court stand and it's a rule in police that you have to get burned in court because you need to be able to know what you're doing in court in order for you to look competent in front of a jury. So there's all these things, and of course, they're not perfect. And there's unfortunately been a lot of cases of like officers like violating constitutional rights, or like it's so gray in certain things. I think there was a podcaster, a very popular one, who somebody called their house and they got swatted. And the police went up there, and there's something called exigent circumstances, meaning that if an officer, depending on what the nature is, if an officer thinks that there's something going on inside of a house, let me rephrase this. Exigent circumstances would be like, say, for example, you hear someone screaming for help inside of a house. That gives the officer authority to make the forced entry into a house. If it's just a regular call for like, hey, I hear arguing, like I can't force myself inside, or I can't force myself inside unless I hear that yell for help. In this case, they were getting swatted, so the officers kind of like, they made entry inside and they started searching part of the house. The podcaster didn't like that, and he said, hey, there's nothing going on here. You guys need to get a search warrant. You guys can leave. And so they left. And based on what I know what was going off of that, they were kind of like bending it a little bit. It was a little bit of gray. The call for service was that somebody shot 2 people and he was going to commit suicide using the same gun. And so that gave him the reason to go inside. But that's a very gray area, and that's why we always try to catch up on case laws like, hey, was that the right idea? Was this the best idea? Was this like the good idea? And if you stop doing that, that's when you start making mistakes, is what I've noticed.
What role does technology play in help keeping police officers in check? Because it seems like we have a lot more body cams and police and stuff like that. And then, well, the advancements of cell phones, everybody has a camera now and all these things. And it seems like those are the things that kind of push a lot of these movements as well, because folks are seeing a lot more of what police are doing, and social media, of course. So does that help keep in check, help you obey the Constitution more? When I say you, and not you particularly, but police officers in general, do you think that helps, or does it cause a bigger problem than it fixes?
I think it can help. I don't know if it's like more than 50% helps than hurts. I don't know what that percentage is. I think what's very interesting about when you said about body cameras, what's very interesting is once body cameras have been implemented, I can't exactly remember the study, but complaints on officers actually went down a significant portion. I think it was maybe more than 50%. Now, it may be true because officers know that they're being recorded, but that may also be the case that citizens know that there's cameras watching them, if that makes sense. Like, as this officer's doing his job, you know, we have, as the years have gone on, we've always say, hey, everything's being audibly and visually recorded. That's always a mouthful. I never say that right. But everything, I always say, hey, everything's being recorded right now. And I point towards the camera, or I point wherever the camera may be. It's like, oh, okay. And a lot of people, they can't make those complaints anymore. Now, again, when there is a complaint, can you fully rely on that camera? No, you can't always fully rely on the camera because it only shows a certain amount. Things can be blocked. Like, we have to turn it off because of battery power, that kind of stuff. It's not a storage issue. It's just battery power because it will run out if it runs all the time. But a lot of times people kind of know, like, oh, well, they got cameras, so I can't really, like, make this complaint, and, like, it would probably be unsustained or unfounded. Not only that, also with the phones and with the emails, now officers, they don't have an excuse to say, like, oh, I didn't go to a class. Now you get the email and see, hey, this is our updated legislation. This is our updated, based off of like the First Circuit Court, for example, or whatever. Like, this is our case law. This is how we operate off of. Hey, if you forget it, you can go to the manual. You can go to the manual online. You don't have to go back to the precinct if you can't do it because you're super busy. You can just look it up on the computer or look it up on your phone and say, hey, this is what you have to do. This is what you have to do. And then you got your supervisors. So, like, the check on police officers, I mean, I've only been a police officer for 3 years. I have to ask other people back then, for those who've been on the job for like maybe 20 plus years, to see how they're keeping the police in check in terms of Constitution. But I say it's a lot. They have, if you initial, you know how everyone signs like the terms and agreements and like nobody reads it. Like, everyone kind of does the same thing, but I always check as much as I can on like what we have to do per the policy. And so if you sign it, guess what? It's like, hey, you signed it. That means you should have read it. Yep. And if you say, oh, I did it, it's like, well, you signed it. So, you know, you're going to be in the jackpot and stuff. So the accountability is it was already like going up even before George Floyd, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it was already getting to that point to restrict. It's not like this wagging of the fingers, like, oh, you better not do this. It's like, hey, there's all this stuff. I know it's a lot, but hey, look, here's the case law here. Here's this. Look, here's the manual where you can read it in case you need it. Hey, if you got any questions, if you're hung up on something, whether you can do this or not, just call me. That's what it needs to be. But unfortunately, the protest side, they want to like wag the finger, for lack of a better term, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like policing and software engineering have a lot in common. You have to always stay on top of whatever is the latest and greatest out there. Police officers, you have to stay on top of the law and the new policies and all these things coming out. So, yeah, definitely sound like a ever-learning job.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't help that the Defund the Police movement as a whole, in my opinion, I could be wrong, as a whole, it's like having a problem that requires a scalpel, but they're using a sledgehammer to address the issue. That's really what the Defund the Police movement seems to be like. Well, let me ask you this. What damage, in light of the fact that they're using a sledgehammer to deal with a very delicate, very complicated, very intricate problem, what damage do you see the movement doing to society? Or what damage has the movement already done to society or to the police force that you've seen since you're actively serving in that role? What damage has the movement caused?
I think that, I'll start with the police in general. Even though they're trying to put the money back, the damage has already been done. So now we have to even pour more money. I would even argue you have to pour even more money into the police department or whatever to actually get back to where we were before. And the reason why I say that is because now you have to deal with attrition rates, especially where my department's attrition rate was always high. And even though they hired 249 officers, they lost 239. So it was only a net plus of 10. And then you have to also realize you're paying these officers in the academy, you're giving them the equipment, you're giving all these training and everything. And you have a lot of these officers that are very new. And at least what it seemed like, at least what I'm being told back then, was say 20 years ago, you had those senior officers who've been on the job for 15 plus years, 20 plus years, and they're regular patrol officers or they're supervisors, and they're like, hey, they'll help and guide this new officer who's off of probation or, who's still on probation, just got off of field training, and they'll guide him to make sure he's going the right track, he's not doing this wrong and all that kind of stuff. If a new guy makes mistakes, I mean, that's expected. That's what the senior officer's there for. But now you have a lot of newer people, and the senior people are like, they only got like 5 years on. Or they only got like 6 years on. They only got like 8 years on. So like, it's the blind leading the blind, unfortunately. To where like we're trying to keep this together, we're trying to solve this, but unfortunately, because a lot of the senior officers or people who can take early retirement, they leave. Or they find a better department that backs them. So they'll go to Texas or go to Florida and get that $5,000 bonus or whatever. And then you're left with like places like New York or, Chicago, where a lot of officers are like, they're kind of trying to, they don't want to violate somebody's rights, but they don't want to get in trouble, but they're trying to do the right thing. Yeah. And so it's very, very difficult. And it tremendously helps when you have somebody who's incredibly experienced, who knows what they're doing, and just to have that as a backup is great. Before I left, I had a guy who was about to retire and he said, I'm not doing this anymore, but he will help me. And he knows, like, yeah, he'll show me the ropes and show me some tricks, tips and tricks. I'm pretty much on policing and on what to do. But where I'm at right now, even though I would argue it's a much better police department with benefits and everything, a lot of the people around me are like very, very young and very new. So it kind of like, we don't really have a senior guy around here where it's like, we don't want to rush into things and cause mistakes. And so we're going a lot slower, if that makes sense. Like, we have to go slow. You should go slow in a lot of these scenarios, but we have to go slow because if we rush this, like a lot of new people do, then that's where mistakes are caused.
How about within the society, though, and stuff like that? Do you see any damages that are happening there?
The society thing is, a lot of the stuff before I left my old department, a lot of them were like, this is stupid. I don't understand why they're saying defund the police. And again, when I was in the projects, and I'm in Section A as well, too, I never saw a single defund the police sign. Mm-hmm. You may have seen Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's cool, whatever. I don't care. You may see ACAB as well, too. I don't really care. That's just background noise. I'm so numb to that now, I don't even care about that. But I never saw a defund the police sign, which is what I noticed. In terms of like crime and everything, a lot of people, they seem like burnt out, at least from a anecdotal point of view. They seem burnt out. It's like, what are these people doing? This guy, wasn't he just here? Didn't you send him to jail or something like that? I said, yeah, but he got out. It's like, and they just like, what are you going to do? Like, and they just start shaking their head. And what was really sad about it is that they kind of just accepted the fact that this was just going to happen. You know what I mean? That this is just going to keep on happening and stuff. So, and we already talked about the high crime, the shootings and the robberies and everything, but that's statistically a fact and it's bad and it's showing. But at least in terms of like the attitudes, people are just like, they're getting burnt and they're also just starting to like accept the fact that it's like happening and it's like, and what are you going to do?
Yeah, they're demoralized. They see what's happening and they just kind of, what can we do? Kind of just throw up your hands situation.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. We don't want to get to that point.
Right.
So we don't want to keep going with that too. So
now, speaking of demoralization, what we've done as a society is that we've asked the police to do the job that we don't want to do. If there were no police, we would have to be the ones policing our own subdivisions, our own neighborhoods, and responding to break-in or any kind of crime or whatever. But what we've done is that we've asked the police to do these things. We've empowered them. We've vested public trust in them to do these things. And it always blows my mind that we would ask people to do these dangerous things and then yell at them when they do them and then say things like defund the police. It's never made any sense to me. And I imagine that within the police force, one of the things that keeps you all going would be camaraderie, realizing that, hey, we're all in this together sort of thing. How is that camaraderie, that morale doing on the police force now? I remember we asked you this question perhaps last year in one of the podcasts that we had with you, and you mentioned that the morale, it's beginning to dip, it's beginning to go down. Do you still see that as the case in your neck of the woods or in general across the country?
I would say it's still low, but I would pretty much say, yeah, it's pretty low still. I know I don't want to say like, oh, it's going up now. We are kind of just, how would I say this? We're at the bottom now. And until we kind of see things getting a little bit better for us, that's when the morale is going to go back up. It's still bad for me. It's like, yeah, the morale still sucks, but I've gotten kind of used to that, if that makes sense. It's not really a good thing. It's kind of like the dog in the cartoons, like, this is fine, you know, and you're just dealing with it. But until we see like at least our leadership, or at least the leadership and the judges and everything start doing their part and everything like that, I think that's when the morale will actually go up. A lot of times, however, I will say this, which kind of maybe changed my attitude, is that I am seeing a lot of people, you know, even black people from the hood and everything like that, saying, hey, we appreciate you and everything like that, because they know, they're starting to realize now, especially in 2021, they're starting to see like, man, these guys are going through a lot. So let me just say a thank you and everything like that. That, if anything, is giving me a little bit of hope. But in terms of like relationship with like the command, it's still low, but at least we're seeing out in the streets, like people are saying, hey, they appreciate it. I'm starting to see it a little bit more often than not compared to like 2020. So
cool. How do you think this movement would end up? We have seen a drastic change in the culture, in the attitudes towards it. And you just mentioned that, hey, some of that is coming back. People are realizing that, hey, police are here to serve and we need them in our communities. So how do you see this movement end?
I don't really know. I know that like with the crime and everything going in reverse, it looks like it's kind of ending now. It's kind of like the beginning of the end right now.
Do you think we have maybe hit a peak and now we're going to start seeing reversal of that?
I think so. I think we've seen a peak. Unfortunately, it's still going to be bad for a little bit. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But at least we've reached that peak of where, like, yeah, this defunding stuff's not really working. And a lot of those people who have been touting it, like I said before in the beginning of this podcast, they're touting it, and now they're just like Homer Simpson into the bush. They're just going back right into it, and they're not saying anything, and they're not apologizing. Like, yeah, this is a bad idea. We didn't think this would happen. And we're all like, yeah, sure. And I don't think we're going to have that conversation with them. You know what? It is what it is. Like, they're not going to do that. All right, that's cool. I'm just going to go ahead and continue to improve what we got to do as, you know, policing, because I do personally think that we should be held to a higher standard, a reasonable one, of course, but we also need to give us the training, give us the tools that are necessary for your standard that you want us to be at. But I think the Defund the Police is like, I guess, on a good note. It's ending. It's at its peak. It's ending. It's kind of going into decline, but we're still going to see the effects of this stuff. I don't know how long, maybe a couple of years, maybe it'll be another year, maybe it'll be 6 months, but it doesn't look like the homicide rates or the crime is going to go down anytime soon. At least the very good thing is that the Defund the Police movement is, we all know for a fact, and maybe the people who've been touting it, they realize it's the problem. So at least that's a good thing. Ended on a positive note. At least they know this was a terrible decision and everything.
Yeah. Officer CigarBro, thank you for your service, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the Removing Barriers podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. You have just heard from Officer CigarBro with his professional opinion on the Defund the Police movement. When we return, we'll have DW come in and tell us what are we missing with the Defund the Police movement and the human sinful nature. We'll be right back.
This is the Removing Barriers podcast. If the podcast or the blog were a blessing to you, leave us a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to share the podcast with your friends. Removing Barriers, a clear view of the cross.
All right, DW, welcome to the Removing Barriers podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
Yes, so we have seen police officers being ambushed and shot in cities like New York, Houston, Texas, and practically all around the U.S. And I believe these are directly tied to the fact that many of these cities have defunded the police, and many of them have bail reform where they release criminals back into society. What do you think the Defund the Police movement is missing when it comes to the human sinful nature?
Well, an article that I was reading recently stated this. It says, for a term that has become so well known, Defund the Police doesn't have a single definition. It covers a spectrum of ideas, from redistributing a portion of police funds towards social services to abolishing the institution altogether. And so the writers of that article asked a lawyer, a criminologist, political science major, as well as a police constable, and they asked them for their thoughts on Defund the Police. And the consensus that I drew from their responses was that instead of promoting safety and security, Defund the Police tends to promote fear and anxiety, confusion and uncertainty. And those things, the fear and anxiety, the confusion and uncertainty, are really the opposites of the gospel in so many ways. In John 10:10, the Lord Jesus Christ said that the thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. And then he contrasted that with himself, and he said, I am come that they might have life. In Isaiah 9:6, the Bible reads and says, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So, the unsaved, unfortunately, are the enemies of God, and they're the objects of his wrath. And we're like those who want to defund the police. We really want to dethrone God. It's not that we don't want a peaceful life or that we never do anything nice for anybody. It's really just that we don't want God to rule over us. And God is the ruler, and he's the maker of the law. We want to go our own way. We don't want to obey his law. And because of that, we break his law. And the Bible calls breaking God's law sin. We sin when we lie. And because God has said, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, Exodus 20, verse 16, and bearing false witness is lying. We sin when we commit adultery. Jesus said, ye have heard that it has been said of them of old time, ye shall not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman so as to lust after her hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. So Jesus said that you could even commit adultery in your heart, and coveting after something that somebody owns that you don't have is really stealing from them in your heart. So sin is not just a matter of what we do, it's also a matter of the heart. And when we sin, we break God's law. The real question isn't, do each of us deserve to be judged? If we were judged by God's just and righteous law, we would get exactly what we do deserve. And the real question, though, is why would God save any of us? And the amazing answer is that he wants to save all of us. He wants to save anyone who call upon him and trust him as their Savior. The moment of salvation, or when someone does get saved, it's like being in a burning building and the fireman comes running in to save you. It's dark in there, there's heat, there's smoke, you can't really see your way out. And that's the way it is with sin. We get so deep in sin that even if we wanted to get out, sometimes we don't know how. And this fireman comes into the building and he leads us out of the fire or carries us out. And we would never stop to that fireman and say, "We did a good job saving me." We're sort of like a drowning man in a lake. And Jesus comes alongside us with a boat and throws the rope out and pulls us up. And we would never say to him, "We did a good job saving me." And so, God literally came to earth and did something for us that we could never do for ourselves. He came here to save us. And Romans 5:8 says, "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." But someone out there may be asking themselves, well, who is Christ and why would he save me? And the Lord Jesus Christ is God incarnate. He's that one in Isaiah 9:6 that's called the Prince of Peace. And he came to earth some 2,000 years ago and took on upon him the form of a servant. And he was obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And someone might ask, well, why did he have to become a man? And Hebrews 2:8 and 9 tells us that he became a man so that he could taste death for every man. Someone else may ask, well, why did he have to be God? And the Bible tells us that he had to be God so that he could pay for the sins of the whole world. 1 John 2:2 says that he is the propitiation, or the substitutional sacrifice, not for our sins only, but for the sins of the whole world. So he had to be of infinite value, and that means he had to be God. But he had to die as a man so that he could pay for the sins of men. So why would God do this? 1 John 4:8 tells us that God is love. There's a very familiar verse, John 3:16, that says, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And that believeth part is sort of like when that fireman comes into the building and you trust him to take you out of the building safely. Or when that man comes upon the boat and comes to pull you out and rescue you, you trust him to pull you to safety. And the Lord Jesus Christ came to earth and died on a cross to pay the price for our sins so that he could save us. But he also didn't just die on a cross. He was raised the third day. In fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:21 that if he was not raised, we would still be dead in our trespasses and sins. So his resurrection proves that he's God, and it is just as necessary as his death. And because of his death, his burial, and his resurrection, God in Jesus Christ came to save us. And the way that we receive him is just by calling out to him and trusting him that he will do exactly what he came to do, and to save us from our sins.
DW, thank you for joining us on the Removing Barriers podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To get a hold of us, to support this podcast, or to learn more about removing barriers, go to removingbarriers.net. This has been the Removing Barriers podcast. We attempted to remove barriers so that we all can have a clear view of the cross.